Welcome, everybody. I hope you're all doing well out there. This is Achyut Bhava from Nightlight Astrology. Today, we are going to be taking a look at Saturn square Uranus and a few thoughts that I've been having as I've reflected on this transit that I want to share today. One of the slogans that you'll hear people use when talking about Uranus is about newness, about innovation, about breaking away from old outworn habits or patterns, or kind of revolution like that. So that part of Saturn Uranus is pretty obvious. Everyone knows that Saturn Uranus can come about and old structures can kind of be demolished, like the Tower card in tarot. A lightning bolt can come down and strike an existing structure, and boom, there's kind of creative chaos, and then some striking new original form or idea that comes as a result of either destroying the new or destroying the old, or the old getting somehow taken down by a force of nature, a force of mind, a force of will. So everyone's familiar with that side of the Saturn Uranus dynamic, and I'm going to reiterate it a little bit before I dive in deeper today. But the thing that I want to talk about today is, what is this? How does Saturn pull on Uranus in the direction of its own Saturnine significations? And how can we understand Saturn Uranus, not so much from the way that Uranus sort of strikes down the old, but how can we understand it from the perspective of Saturn making a demand on Uranus? And in my opinion, that's the less talked about, less explored, less understood dynamic of the archetypal interaction. Planets are always interacting with one another in both ways. In aspects like squares, the one that we have in the sky right now between Saturn and Uranus, both planets are pulling on one another. We have to understand how the archetypal combination works, not just in one side, not just on one side, but on both sides. So that's what we're going to try to do today. Now, before we dive in, I'd love to see where you're all coming from. I always like to hear just where you guys are located in the world. Roll call. From England. Hello. Hey, Faye. Good to see you out there. Pennsylvania, UK, Switzerland, Charlotte, London, Malta, Quebec. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna to you. Italy, Michigan. Amazing. New York City, Birmingham. Wow. So cool. So cool to see you all out there. So before I get any more deeply into this topic, I want to share my screen and get the real-time clock up, and let's refresh on what's happening here. So we've got this big stellium in Aquarius forming. We have a big new moon coming up on the 11th, and I'm going to narrow it down to just Saturn and Uranus, the big transit of the month, which I feel like we need to talk about from a few different angles this month so that we really have a good, deep understanding of it. So here on the one hand is Saturn in Aquarius, and here is Uranus in Taurus. These two planets are in a square with one another. What is the nature of a square? The nature of a square is the nature of Mars. So they're in a Marsy relationship, which means action-oriented, but also potentially kind of tense, combative, or a little bit hostile. So it's especially good when you have a square to understand how the demands of each planet are placed on the other. Uranus is going to have a kind of a way of asserting itself toward Saturn that Saturn has to sort of deal with, and Saturn's going to assert itself toward Uranus, and Uranus is going to have to respond. You can always tell within an aspectual dynamic in ancient astrology which planet is going to tend to have the more dominant role to play. In this case, it's Saturn, because Saturn is in what we call the superior position. The superior position can be found if you imagine the planet, both planets in an aspect, to be looking in toward the middle of the wheel. The planet that is on the position where on the side that casts its ray to its right. So here's Saturn. Saturn is casting its ray, its square, to Uranus from its right-hand side. You imagine that you are Saturn and that you're looking in toward the middle of the wheel, And to your right shoulder, off your right shoulder, if you're Saturn, your ray is going out to connect with Uranus. Now, if you're Uranus looking in at the circle, your ray is going back to connect with Saturn off from your left-hand side. So that right-handed and left-handedness was associated with yin and yang, or with dominance or assertiveness versus receptivity. And that was part of how astrologers looked at which planet was going to be more dominant within the archetypal exchange of two planets. And this goes for any aspect except for the opposition, where there's more of an equal but opposite kind of situation going on. So at any rate, Saturn has the upper hand here. And, most of what I have seen has put Uranus in the dominant position in terms of the interpretations. And that's a little bit of a mistake. And that's why I want to talk about it today. So what does it mean when Saturn and Uranus are together, but Saturn is a little bit more dominant than Uranus? Okay, so before we go into that, let's take a look at the timeline for this. You can see that Saturn is coming to make a square to Uranus on February 17th. So here's the square forming, 713 and 713. That's February 17th. So we're talking about 2 weeks from now. But this is building anytime the planet is within about 3 degrees of perfecting an aspect. That's typically when ancient astrologers said that the events, or the peak events of the transit, it's all process oriented, of course, but there are events that tend to manifest and somehow define or characterize the energy of the entire transit. And those tend to happen during these peak periods, which can happen within 3 degrees applying and perfecting, or 3 degrees of separating, or a little bit of both you'll get this recurring too. This same transit is going to recur in June, and then at the end of the year in December. So we have a few passes of these planets this year. Okay, so now that you have a visual of it, here's what I want to talk about today. Let's talk about the way in which typically Uranus sort of gets the upper hand, right? You're typically going to see the planet Uranus in this dynamic being the one that sort of leads the way in popular sort of sentiment and interpretation. And it's basically, like I said earlier, it's basically the Tower card from tarot. So what is the Tower card? The Tower card shows let's see if I can actually pull up a picture of the Tower card, just in case you haven't seen it before. Yeah, I'll just pull one up here. Here's this is a pretty good one. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and see if I can show you this. All right, so you have, here's the Tower card, right? Here's an old sort of monolithic, structure. And it has the crown on top of it, the old established, tradition, or the old way of doing things. And it gets struck down by lightning. A force of nature comes, strikes it down. Everyone's freaking out, diving out of the tower. So it's destructive. But it's also, there's an invigorating dimension to this. And that has to do with the fact that, this transit, you're going to see quite commonly with this transit, actually, a sense of innovative, original, revolutionary, like that. So, and why? Like, where does that come from? It comes from the lightning bolt, right? So and Uranus is associated with electricity and lightning and things like that. Okay, so just close this here. So where there is that element of sudden destruction, where there is that element of sudden, unexpected breakups of tradition or structure or habit, and it could be both destructive but also revolutionary. That's Uranus. And Saturn fits really nicely into that picture to establish Uranus's dominance in the interpretation, because Saturn is often read as the old tower, right? The old structure. And that's unfortunate, because that is only one of very many meanings that Saturn has. But it does fit. I'm not saying it doesn't. It definitely fits to think of the Tower card as a kind of Uranus-Saturn dynamic. We talked about earthquakes, and I've talked about, sudden breakups of traditions or structures. And that's all the Uranus-heavy version of the transit. Okay, so what we're trying to do today is say, well, what is the Saturn dominant view of this transit? what does it mean when Uranus is colored by Saturn rather than Saturn being, painted in the picture of Uranus? In other words, what happens when Saturn isn't just the tower getting struck by lightning? What else could it be? What else could it do? So that's what we're going to go into. All right. I want to consider an idea. This is an idea that it could you could think of it as encapsulating the Saturn-Uranus dynamic from Saturn's standpoint. And I'm going to use a phrase. The limit is your freedom. The limit or the limitation is your freedom. All right. So that's the idea that I just take that in very deeply. Even after I go through kind of unpacking this, just sit with that, and even in almost like mantra meditation fashion, I would highly recommend over the weeks ahead taking that into a quiet inner place and just spending some time with that phrase. It's something that can really serve us right now. It's not something that I feel like we think about a lot, because usually our usual way of thinking about limitations is that we don't like them. Nobody likes restrictions. Nobody likes limitations. Nobody likes the cosmic red light, the cosmic no, the thumbs down, the negation, the prohibition. No, most people I speak with and work with every day are talking about how can I overcome limitations. So it's very rare that we think of limitations as a good thing or even as a liberating thing. So here is, and I'm certainly not going to be sitting here advocating today for some kind of punitive, harsh strictness that will set you free, but I do want to talk about the virtue of this idea. Limitation is the freedom. Your limit is your freedom. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a Saturn-Uranus dynamic that happened in my life. When I was a freshman in college, I had just gone through a Saturnine period. A Saturn period is defined by a lot of different things, but for me, it involved a lot of isolation, a lot of solitude, feeling like something of a black sheep. High school, basically my last years of high school, which I'm guessing for a lot of people are kind of like that. It's like you're trying to fit in, you're trying to find your niche, and a lot of people struggle, and a lot of people, school can be really cruel, as I'm sure a lot of you know. So I was going through a Saturnine period. I get to college, and for whatever reason at college, I really started read like what is it? Hitting my stride again. I certainly started to feel in sync with myself, with others, socially, etc. And I was playing on the lacrosse team. I had never even played lacrosse, but because it was a club team and it was basically just for fun, I decided to walk on and learn how to play lacrosse. So I was playing lacrosse and decided one Sunday afternoon. Well, backstory first. This was feeling really redeeming to me, right? It was like I felt like this black sheep, and I was pretty isolated and pretty lonely and angsty during high school. My last 2 years of high school, I went through this program they have in Minnesota called post-secondary enrollment options. So it's you can leave high school and go to a nearby community college, and the Minnesota State curriculum transfer program or something like that allows those credits to transfer over to the college that you go to after high school. So I was going to a community college full-time my junior and senior year, and basically stacking philosophy classes because I could. You could really do whatever you wanted to. So I was just stacking philosophy classes, and I was really alone. And sometimes kind of, that kind of angsty emo 17-year-old kid or whatever, pounding power chords in my basement, but it was a lonely time. And then I get to school, and through the socialization of this lacrosse team, I felt like I was like redeeming something that I wished I would have had in high school. And it was really pretty, if I look back on it, it was really pretty stupid. Um, but I was feeling so happy with all of this. So on a Sunday afternoon, I get together with a bunch of people on the lacrosse team and some guys in my dorm and stuff like that. And we were playing football on a practice field for the college football team. That was just, it wasn't the official field. That we would have got in trouble for that, I'm sure, but it was this back practice field, and we were playing on it. And as we were playing, I tried to tackle my roommate who had the football and was running with it. And he fell on top of me, and my whole weight of my body twisted and went down into the ground. My elbow went into the ground, and then he landed like a sledgehammer right on my shoulder, and I ended up getting a compound fracture. My bone literally broke in half. My humerus. So, and it wasn't humorous. So I'm laying there on the ground screaming. My arm looked like a rainbow. I can't even describe how gross it looked, but it was like totally messed up. Right? This was a Saturn and Uranus combination in my birth chart. So anyway, long story short, I had to have a plate put in my arm. If you ever see me, so I have a huge long scar on my left arm, and I lost the use of my wrist. I could not. I had a radial nerve that was stretched, and so I had a drop wrist like this, like a dropped wrist, and I couldn't lift it. It was unusable. Like I couldn't even move my fingers really. So for about 8 months, I couldn't play lacrosse. I couldn't really do anything, and I couldn't lift my wrist. And I had to wear this bizarre glove that a occupational therapist made for me, and it was a glove that kept my fingers straight, but it was like a wristband, and it had these long hooks that went out over my fingers, and there were these little like scoops, like little bucket scoops that my fingers went in, so that my hand would stay out and straight, so that the nerve would, as it tightened back up, that I would have full motion back. So you have to keep your hand straight like that. So for my entire freshman year, immediately, uh, you know, I got a big broken arm poop in my swimming pool. Like that's what happened. That's what happened. I just, it was gone. All of that joy and all of that sense of belonging, and it was gone through a freak accident that came on very, very suddenly and paralyzed my hand for about 8 months. All right. So that's the background of this Saturn Uranus story. Now, as a result of that, what happened? Well, I'll never forget the day that I got out of the hospital. Radiohead, who was my favorite band when I was that age, starting with the Bends and OK Computer, which were like two of my favorite albums. But they came out with a new album called Kid A, and I don't know if you guys are Radiohead fans, so you might remember Kid A. And I went to get Kid A with my weird, like my weird Darth Vader looking hand. And I remember listening to it in my room, and it was so dark and so mysterious, but beautiful as well. And I remember sitting there going, this is not going to go how I thought it was going to go. And I was part of this actually was the beginning of how I ended up getting hooked on pain pills, because I was prescribed really, pretty intense painkillers that I ended up getting addicted to, even though I didn't use them after the prescription ran out. The need or desire for them stayed in my mind. And about a couple of years later, I had another accident or injury, and was prescribed them again, and it just built like that. So I always attribute that always also to the beginning of this kind of weird taste for opiates that I ended up having to really purge from my life later and get clean. Anyway, so I'm sitting there and I'm going like, my life is not going to be the same. This is not like, I'm not going to have a normal year. I'm back to where I was in high school, which is alone in solitude. And I mean, I was really depressed. I remember it just being really, really depressed, and I slept a lot more and blah, blah, blah. And then one day I was a philosophy major, and I had a professor who, to this day, remains one of my favorite professors I've ever had. And his specialty was in Eastern philosophy. And he just sort of looked me in the eye when I went into his office one day, and he said, "Are you doing okay?" And I was like, it sort of pierced my heart a little bit. It just opened my heart, and it got in there somehow, over the little armor that was there after having this injury, because he cared. And I just said, "I don't know. I don't know. It's really hard." Something like that. I just kind of basic. And he said, "Well, there's no better time to study philosophy." And it was a simple thing that he said, but I knew he was right. He said, "There's no better time to study philosophy." And so for the rest of that year, because my social life was in a sense destroyed, it was not normal, and it was painful and embarrassing for me to go out with a hook on my hand and all this crazy stuff. So I was my year became a year of very, very deep contemplative reading of philosophy. The rest of that year, I became, straight A student, and I was, just neck deep in ancient philosophy, and that set the foundation really for the rest of my life. So, in a weird way, this limitation, this constraint that came on through this kind of freak Uranian type of accident, ended up being the ground for an almost monastic level of commitment to studying Greek philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and reading and writing. And I dealt with, a little bit of insomnia and depression. It was sort of melancholic time. But during that time, it was punctuated over and over again by these lightning strikes of intellectual and spiritual revelation. So the habit, the confinement, the limitation, the paralysis, the broken bone, the dark humor of the broken humorous, really, throughout the year, set in and put me on a path of almost like monastic discipline with studying philosophy, and so many breakthroughs of mind and spirit happened as a result of those constraints and that confinement. So that was my freshman year, and I always remember how I never could have found that degree of mental and spiritual and intellectual liberation and freedom if it weren't for the confines and sort of melancholic constraint of that broken bone and the paralysis of my hand. So that's what we mean when we say, when Saturn pushes on Uranus, it can become the case where the limitation is the freedom. The limitation is the ground that then the Uranian impulse for freedom becomes in service to it. The Uranian freedom becomes a servant to the confining or limiting the parameters that Saturn sets. I'm going to give you another example. Another part of my life that reflects this, and I'm guessing that you guys in hearing this have stories like this too, so I would love to hear yours in the chat box and how you've had moments like this. When has the limitation become your freedom? Becoming a dad, that has been one of the biggest ones for me. So I have a pretty strong Uranus in my chart. It's very angular, in a very tight trine with the sun in my chart and so forth. So I've always been someone who's really, heck, I practice astrology. I said, heck, I'm definitely back in Minnesota. If you say heck, oh, never mind. Anyway, so I have a strong Uranus in my chart, and I've always been inclined toward freedom, and becoming a dad was a huge, a huge sense of limitation or constraint. The sleepless nights, the screaming, the diapers, the bodily fluids everywhere, the tantrums and meltdowns, like so many things that to me suddenly, and of course there's all the joys there. There's so many things, aspects of course of having a child that are totally delightful. The laughter, the games, the fun, the affection, the sweetness, the songs, so all of that's there. I'm someone who tends to look for the absurd humor and the elements of darkness because I can't ignore them. Even though I'm a pretty optimistic person, I have to make peace with and find either a good sense of humor about or a place for the elements of things that I don't like. I can't just sit there and be like, "Come on, man, just get more positive. Just let that stuff go." It's like, no, it needs a place somehow on the shelves of my life. Like I'm a Taurus Venus ruled person. Like if it doesn't feel like it has some kind of feng shui placement in my life, then I don't feel good about it. So I have to find room and space for all these difficult things, right? Anyway, that's just a pretext to say that I was really, really struggling to find where on the shelf of my life does all of the horrors of having a kid go? Like where this is my first one, Gigi. And it was really, really hard. And I got into this habit after my wife and daughter were asleep at night. I would stay up, and a lot of the times I would just cry. I would cry, and I would look like what is it, The Thinker by Rodin, the like this, like, and in my head I'm just going like, oh my God, I've screwed my life over. What have I done? like that. Or I would just be like, I'm not mature enough for this. I have no patience. I can't, I'm, you know, because I think in being a parent, even though you're going through like, I wouldn't say that like on the level of the actions and the motions of being a parent that I have like messed up, or I think I've been, decent. I would put myself in the average to above average category in terms of just showing up and doing parent stuff and having a good attitude about it. That doesn't mean that in your head you're not going through all this turmoil, like, oh my God, I'd rather be doing this, or like, oh, this is like driving me crazy, or these frenzied thoughts that come in and make you feel like you're not doing it right, or you're not the real deal, or you should love this and you don't, or it's like there's all this turmoil. And I would just sit up late at night, and man, I would just I would just be like, like that. And it was like every night for at least the first year and a half. And it felt like a prison. It felt like a prison. I'm not proud to say that. Like, I'm sure that there are people out there who are like, oh, sorry for you that you've got, you're such a sulky Sue or whatever. Like, no offense to any Susans out there, but like, sorry that you couldn't enjoy it. Well, I couldn't. Like, I couldn't. There were aspects of my day that I would enjoy, but I keep coming back to that place of feeling like maybe I've ruined my life. And this was a really, really hard thing for me as a parent. It's definitely like been the most important, maybe growth, like classroom of my life. Like the parent classroom in my life has been like, that's been hard. I've got Moon in Capricorn. It's been hard for me. It's been hard for me to not end up feeling somewhat confined by it. I mean, previous to having kids, my life was like all of my 20s. I basically lived alone in solitude in cabins in, little houses in grad school out in the country, and wrote and read and stuff like that like isolated contemplative monastic mood that started when I was in school, when I broke my arm, really just continued throughout all of my 20s. And so having a kid suddenly felt like this huge constraint being placed on me psychically. But here's what came out of that. Every night, because I had to become confronted more and more with the fact that there was nowhere to go, right? I'm not going to bail on my kids. Like I love this enough, and I know it's important and good enough for me that I'll never bail, right? I'll always be there, and I'll always show up, and I'll always try to do my best at this. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm going through this excruciating sense of pain and loss. And people had told me that before. My parents had told me that. Lots of people told me that being a parent's like an ego death. It's really hard. But I just never, I wasn't anticipating that it would be so challenging. It was challenging for my wife too. It still is for both of us, but thankfully we have each other to talk about this, So what started happening was I finally hit a place where I said, I can't just stay up late at night despairing anymore. I have to do something with this space in the evening when everyone's gone to bed. And my wife's not an evening person. She's a morning person. I tend to be more of a night person. So I have to do something with. So what I ended up doing was I ended up getting back into prayer, and I ended up getting back into some of my spiritual practices, which initially, when I had children, had sort of fallen by the wayside because I was so exhausted and I was so tired and I was so just depressed, really, that I had sort of let them go. And it was through that limitation, through that kind of these dark nights of the soul, these dark parenting nights, that I finally said, well, I might as well just throw my hands up in prayer. Somewhere in this space of confinement and limitation, there's got to be a hallelujah in here somewhere. And I don't know what it is in me that, like, that there's just a stupid persistence about finding some kind of gold, within the confines of these kinds of spaces. But that's what I did. I just said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to take this opportunity to become the person that I wish I could be, which is someone who feels at the very least a little bit more comfortable with these limitations, who feels, I don't know, it made me feel like, you get a piece of clothing, like I don't know, like a pair of boots or something, and you first wear them and you're like, this is great, but it'll be really great in 2 years when they're like worn in. And I just said to myself, you know what? Like, I need to be able to wear parenting comfortably. The pain and difficulty of it, the isolation, the constraints. I want this to become like a well-worn in boot that I feel comfortable in. It's not that I know that the pain and the difficulties of it aren't going to go away. I just need to break this in. And I was like, well, the only thing that's really going to help me is prayer and meditation and my spiritual practice. And it was one night while I was doing that, one night in particular, that I remember, where we had a little hot tub on the porch. It was very small. It was like 2 people could fit in it. And I was sitting in the hot tub, and I had just sort of started praying and meditating again. And I said, I said, God, I can't do this by myself. I need a teacher. I need some guides. I need a mentor. And I'm not even sure that anything like that really exists. I'm not sure is that even a thing? Like, is that out there? And if there is, could you just send me one? I had never prayed that prayer my entire life, never, that I can ever remember anyway, that I had said, I need a spiritual guide specific to me, like a good match. So I told my wife about the prayer, right? I said to my wife, like the next day or something, I said, there's this prayer that I prayed last night. And, she knew what I was doing, what I was going through. We talk about everything. And she handed me a book by a teacher that was teaching at our yoga studio. He taught the philosophy portion of our yoga teacher training program. He had just written a book called In Search of the Highest Truth. And I looked at it with my typical, like, I can be sort of cynical at first. And I was like, great. Another yoga teacher wrote a book. Great. Like, that's not what I want. Not at all what I want to read, because I'm sure that his insights are not interesting and like trite. And what do they compare to the deep thinkers that I read, like Carl Jung, or like very arrogant, like super arrogant. And she was like, well, why don't you just give it a try? And I was like, I picked it up and I said, I'll look at it. So I ended up opening up the book and reading the first chapter, and I was like, I actually really liked it. So then I kept going and I read the whole thing. And then my wife said, well, he teaches private yoga teacher training programs. And I had been saying, like, maybe I'll take another yoga teacher training program or something. I just knew that the answer for my feeling of being restricted was to go into it and find discipline and commitment and practice, sadhana. Somehow I needed that. I knew that was the antidote. Like treats like. Don't go running from this. I'm not going to run from my wife, run from my kids, run from being a dad just because it kind of sucks and is hard in parts. I got to go into it. So how can I go into it? And I thought, well, maybe I'll do this yoga teacher training program. So I ended up following I ended up calling him and talking to him, and ended up studying with him. And for about a year of my life, once a week, I would sit over at his apartment, and for like 8 hours a day, I would sit on a little mat about 3 feet in front of him on his little mat, and we would be sitting and talking yoga philosophy for like 8 hours. And I'm not kidding. Through that process, during that process, I got an invitation, and I was really upping my yoga game at this point and really starting to feel like the boots were getting worn in. Like I'm this is really helping me. The suckiness doesn't go away completely, and but I'm starting to appreciate it. It's starting to feel not just like suckiness, but suckiness with soul. You know what I mean? And that's different. It feels different. So then I got an invitation to speak at an East meets West astrology conference in Calcutta. And I told my teacher about it. I said, "No, Hari, like I got invited to India. Like we're studying yoga. Like, this is so cool. Like, shouldn't I go see something?" And he said, "Well, when are you going?" And I told him the dates. And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going to be about 4 hours north of Calcutta at a pilgrimage site for bhaktas, called Mayapur. And I'm going to be there at the same time that your conference is happening. Maybe you should come up early and meet me in Mayapur, and then afterward go to your conference, and I can like show you around." So I did. I went to this sacred pilgrimage site for bhaktas, and if you're into bhakti, Mayapur. But at any rate, I went to Mayapur, and my wife let me go, which was, to this day, it's gonna make me cry if I think about it, but it was a really, really deeply generous thing that she did, because she had to be alone with our daughter to do it, and she let me go. And while I was there, I had just, it felt like the doors of my heart got completely blasted open. And what was I doing while I was there? I was sitting in an ashram all day chanting and not doing anything, right? So the same limitation, the same sense of cloistered confinement was there, but it was as though inside of it was this ocean of sweetness, this ocean of nurturing milk. And on the last day, my teacher left, and I had a day or two there by myself. And he had been showing me around, and now I was on my own, and I didn't know where to go. And so I said another prayer. I said, maybe there's a guru here, because I had not let go of how significant it had been that within days of saying that original prayer, "Lord, please give me a teacher," that one had appeared in my life. And he wasn't an initiating guru. So I knew that if I wanted to go deeper with bhakti, eventually I would need to find one. And I did want to go deeper with bhakti, especially after being there and having studied it for a year at that point and practiced for a year. So I just went wandering around Mayapur, and I just was asking people if they knew of any classes that were happening, because there were classes happening all over the area with different monks and sadhus and gurus in the bhakti lineage. So I ended up stumbling into a classroom, excuse me, and my guru was teaching the class. And I didn't know at the time, because I barely even remember what he said, but there was a kirtan at the end that he led, and the kirtan felt like it was like lit something on fire in my heart. And I ended up going through the streets that night. There's a big elephant parade going through the streets, taking the deities out to see everyone. And there was kirtan in the streets, and it was like, it might as well have been like a, Woodstock or something. I mean, there was probably a couple thousand people, and it was just, you couldn't even move. And we were walking through the streets, more like almost like being carried through the streets. And I was singing kirtan, and like it felt like my mind and my heart got completely blown open. Well, he had been the one who started the kirtan and then suggested that we go and join the elephant parade. So anyway, I was really, really curious to know more about him when I got home. And I searched on YouTube. I just searched the name of the place that I was at and the date, because I knew the date and I knew the name of the place, but I didn't know who the guru was that had been speaking. And sure enough, I found a video recording on YouTube of the class that I was in. There I am on video, sitting there in some Indian classroom. And I found out the guru's name. And I thought, well, he did something. That guy triggered something in me that was fan-freaking-tastic. So I want to hear what he has to say. So I started listening to his classes, and that was how I met my guru. And that all happened about 1 year from the date. All of that happened within about a year of the date of praying that prayer and asking for a teacher. My limitations, my constraint, my difficulty, because I took the risk of going into it rather than trying to break free of it in some kind of act of total rebelliousness and defiance, my defiance was to say, I'm not going to let the limit me. Instead, the limit is going to be my freedom. I'm going to take that weird stance about this and go into it. And that's what I did. And that's how I became a monk myself. That's how I eventually found my guru. That's how I found my teacher. So that was also a Saturn Uranus dynamic in my birth chart. So I wanted to share those two stories with you. I want to read you something that comes from James Hillman, who wrote about Saturn in a book called Senex and Puer. This book is a really good one when it comes to understanding the archetypal difference between, say, Saturn and Jupiter. But there's a chapter in this book called Negative Senex. Now, Senex means like old man. It's where we get the word senator from. But it can mean elder and sort of has a connotation of being wise or potentially sort of curmudgeonly, like an old person can be either the wise grandfather or the like stifling, controlling old man or something like that. And this could be a woman too. It doesn't really matter. All right. So here's a few passages from Hillman that I want to elaborate upon. The limitations which Saturn at the outer rim of the spheres imposes upon the other gods, and which Senex consciousness imposes upon the psyche, may be seen as a modified form of negation. There remains a real value in the Saturnian ego informed by the Senex spirit of limitation. Know thyself becomes know thy limits, beyond which are powers that do not belong to any human. The ego can then no longer be a doer and maker, a creator, or any of the romantic expectations that the hero asks of us. Ego becomes a conserver, a guardian figure, or a witness at the frontiers of a weak kingdom, who dozes at the edge of star-filled madness in continual relation with what's out there. A consciousness of limitation both rules and is in exile. It drifts among the complexes, a watchman in the night of their fantasies, keeping time by the measure of images traversing the inner sky, an astrologer of constellations. The hero's gone under. His rule is through depression and sacrifice. For limitation means serving Saturn, the god of sacrifice. Moses and Abraham, patriarchs, demanding the entirety, quote, costing not less than everything, so close to Moloch. The kingdom shrinks, decrease is on the ascendant. What is not sacrificed will anyway decay. But sacrifice, which is depression in another guise, and is limitation too, is not a one-time gesture. Through prolongated depression, sacrifice becomes chronic. One keeps up the sacrifice and perpetuates limitation into a mode mimetic to the Senex god. Beautiful. And then the next portion, he talks about this. The redemptive power of Senex contradiction is discovered by turning to the contradiction itself. The antithesis of its nature release healing insight. The insight is a function of thought, contemplation, speculation, music, mathematics, and especially imagination become the via regia. Problems are taken to their extremity, where they no longer are living realities, but have become fantastic, reflecting their source in imaginal reality. The world is taken back into its logos, the end into its beginning in nous. issues are removed from the narrowed field of personally particularized depression and expanded into a melancholic contemplation of impersonal and imaginal universals. The acedia of silence and the turning inward by refusing to blame anyone but oneself and one's stars lead to the interior space, memoria. Crucial to this inward move is realizing that interiority must be black and empty. Otherwise, the antidote cannot appear in the poison. Rigid, self-centered focusing without escape into future hopes is precisely the melancholy method, a process of archetypal self-correction. The very agitation and circling thoughts that accompany the narrowing solitude and interior imaginal monologues are the peripheral activities that go along with every kind of centering. The contradictories of center and circumference appear in the paradox of agitated depression, hand-wringing, pacing, insomnia. The intensely focused desert saint is assailed by chattering distractions. The old king wanting to be left alone to his books at the same time as out busily defending far-flung borders. The structure obsessively works at its inner opposition. So I thought you guys would like that. What do I take from that? Well, this is exactly what I love so much about Saturn Uranus on the Saturn side of things. The Uranus side of things is great too, where Uranus says, hey, let's just break down old structures. Let's innovate. Let's rebel. Let's be defiant. Let's be original. Let's cast out the old. And there is a time and a season for that. But what about the Saturn side when Saturn pushes on Uranus? And when it does so, it says, your freedom is not in the heroic overcoming of limitation, the heroic constant innovation of the new compared to the old, the constant heroic projections of a future that's braver and better and more evolved and more sophisticated and more moral than it is right now. No, on the Saturn side of things, we say, I'm going into the limitation, I'm going into the depression, into the absurdity, into the darkness, into the feelings of failure and moral struggle. I'm going into my wound. And in that space, I'm sitting down and I'm staying and I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to stay here and I'm going to chew the chewed. I'm going to chew it. I'm going to sit and I'm just going to chew on this. And when we do that, the force of habit that we develop in the stubborn persistence to sit within that space, that the habit of that becomes prayer. At first, it's a habit, and that part sucks because you have to take this risk of almost amplifying and increasing the level of constraint and difficulty that you feel that you want to be free from. And it seems counterintuitive to add more, in a sense, restraint and control or discipline or habit. It almost seems to amplify the feeling of being stuck. But then if you stick with it persistently, prayer is habit until habit becomes prayer. And that's how it works. And prayer liberates, because by going into prayer, we become a guardian of all of our experiences. And that's how Saturn was understood. Saturn was the guardian of the planets that sat on the threshold between the visible and the invisible. What tremendous breakthroughs of imagination, thought, heart, and soul exist when and come up when we just say, I'm going to sit here stubbornly and persistently to be with these things. And then all of a sudden, prayer explodes from habit. What does habit mean? What are some of the etymological meanings? Habit means condition, demeanor, appearance, or dress. So yeah, there's a way in which to get into prayer or to get the benefits of any kind of spiritual practice, there's a weird way in the beginning where it feels like a feigned appearance. It feels mechanical. It feels overly structured. It feels like a false front that we're putting on somehow. It doesn't feel natural. But weirdly, habit also means to dwell, to reside in, to inhabit, and to stay. So there's two dimensions. Habit is there's a dimension of habit that is this external appearance. Not surprisingly, Saturn was a god that was called the god of feigned appearances. Habits that are just rote and mechanical and dry, and I shake your hand. How are you? I'm doing well today. How are you? Good. We've accomplished the social convention. So Saturn has that dimension to it. We always tend to go to that dimension of it. But what we don't realize is that if you shake enough hands sincerely, you'll eventually love shaking people's hands. It won't just be a convention, right? If you tell people, I care about you, are you having a good day today? If you say it enough with sincerity, the habit will become sincere. You will actually care about how people are doing. You'll care if people are having a good day or not. So Saturn, the ruler of feigned appearances, but also a planet that was associated with the substance of mystical awareness that comes through sitting in habit with prayer or with meditation or with stillness or with reading or solitude or anything. So I ended up becoming a monk because I believe so deeply that the habits and practices of spiritual life are profoundly liberating if you can just stick with them long enough that the habit, the appearance, the clothing, the costume ends up becoming a place that you dwell in and reside. You reside in. And that's what happens with Saturn Uranus. That's the breakthrough that can happen with Saturn Uranus. If you take the constraint that comes up and you just try to blast through it, because blindly we just believe that newness, innovation, originality is always better than anything that's constraining in any way, then you're never going to get the really profound sense of freedom that can come with Saturn Uranus, where it's like, no, just stick with it a little while and watch what comes up. Until we learn the staying power of habit, to reside in good habits, they can't become the moving meditation of prayer. They can't become the organic space of prayer. We have to be willing to taste the poison of artifice, which is nothing more than a reflection of our own stuckness. And if we can move through that with a little bit of courage, determination, and faith, then all of a sudden, boom, it's like lightning starts striking everywhere. And what appears to the world, like people look at me and they go, oh, you live such a regimented life. It's like, it doesn't feel that way to me. It did at first. But I find that when I sit down for 90 minutes, 2 hours a day to meditate every single day now for going on 3-4 years of being a monk, I find that these places are constantly like, there are sacred trees getting struck by lightning everywhere, lighting on fire and becoming little burning bushes. It could be about something really simple, but I'll tell you, nothing has made me feel like a better parent, a more present parent, and more peace with the flaws that I have as a parent. So those are Saturn Uranus dynamics in my own life that I thought you guys might find interesting. There are two people that really, to my mind, had Saturn Uranus dynamics in their chart that really define the Saturn Uranus dimension of life really well on the Saturn side. One was Christopher Reeve. So you probably know he played Superman in like the 80s, I think it was, and he was an actor, and he had a terrible horseback riding accident where he I think his spinal cord almost severed completely, like neck from body almost entirely, but he ended up becoming completely paralyzed. I think the correct term is quadriplegic, but he ended up becoming completely paralyzed. And there's see how paralysis comes in again? And yet he himself said that in some ways the best thing that ever happened to him was becoming paralyzed, because through paralysis he came to understand what freedom really is. He came to understand what humility really means. He came to understand what love really means, especially with his wife. He came to understand what charity and philanthropy really meant. And he was a lightning rod for, really, I don't know much about it, but apparently very exciting research scientifically. There's a Saturn Uranus thing. How can we eventually help people who have this injury recover? I'm going to invest in stem cell research or whatever it was that he was investing in. So he found freedom in this incredible restraint. Now, it's an extreme story, and I know that it's not like you can't just go and be like, yeah, so I'm going to be like that today with all of my limits. You know what I mean? But it's like, it's something to work for. Like, we can do that. We really can do that. And we don't need total paralysis to give us the opportunity to do so. If we take a moment to look at how we get paralyzed by the everyday mundane blocks of our lives, if we just get honest with ourselves about that, uh, and also honest about the fact that they're not going to go away, right? There's nothing we can go and do or get or actions we can take to try and fix it in some superficial sense until we reconcile with those things deep within us. Um, we won't dwell, we won't reside in them. We'll have this kind of oppositional relationship with them. Not surprisingly, Saturn was the god of oppositions. Another one was Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound had this, he's a poet, modern poet, and he had this phrase that he used, or that he was famous for saying, called "make it new." So if you guys have ever studied poetry or literature, you've probably heard of it before. Now, I want to tell you, there's some really interesting articles about the history of where this phrase came from. It wasn't actually original to Ezra Pound. It actually came from this sort of, if I'm not mistaken, it was like a Confucian idea. It was an Eastern idea that he had been picking up. And a lot of people read it, make it new, as innovate, avant-garde, originality, defy conventions, right? Like that. That's not actually what Ezra Pound meant by this phrase that he used called "make it new." Um, what he was really saying in this, and he was a Saturn Uranus person. He was born with Saturn Uranus in a square in his chart. What he was saying really is that that there isn't really anything new under the sun, but every day there is an opportunity to see and experience the new in terms of recombinations, recurrences of previously or even eternally existing ingredients. And so he was someone who had this kind of really terse, almost like haikus, like very terse, minimalistic writing style. And his motto was to sort of look for the new in the old, look for the new in the recycled stuff of everyday life. There's always something new there in what appears to be just the everyday stuff, in the everyday stuff that to some people might look really old. And this runs contrary to the flagrant optimism of New Age thinking that's just constantly about new horizons, new opportunities, new possibilities, future, future, future. We have to understand that the past and the future are both traps. When we understand their relationship as it exists in the soul, in soulful life, in soulful living, it's only then that we really can appreciate the new as it exists in the old and the old as it exists in the new. And that's what Ezra Pound is really getting at when he said, make it new. And this is another thing that's great about Saturn Uranus, is that it's an opportunity to take things that look like limitations, that look old, that look mundane, that look limiting, that look like some kind of cosmic red light, and to say, I'm going to make it new. How am I going to make it new? By being with it through a contemplative mind, through an open heart. I can see the same thing that I always see in the light of this moment. So if we, in a weird way, the other thing that happens with spiritual practice is that we learn the art of presence. And it's presence alone that eliminates the need for constant revolutions and rebellions against the old into the new, as well as the constant laboring of traditions that should never be done away with, that should lead us and, keep away the dangerous newness of the future. These voices have been battling from time eternal. There's never been a time where those two voices aren't on some level already existing in a tense oppositional dialogue with one another. So how do we do something else? How do we make something that's truly new? Well, to do that, we have to, through force of habit, our lives become prayer. And the prayer is organic. It ends up, to some people, eventually it'll be like, well, you're really regimented. It's like, no, it might appear that way, but I've discovered something new that lives within this appearance. I've come to inhabit my life. So anyway, I hope that this has been interesting for you guys, just kind of a philosophical journey down the Saturn Uranus road. I think there'll be some more because there's a couple of other angles we can take with this, but I wanted to emphasize this one because when I look right now at the web, here's what I see. In like by and large, what I see is this formula for Saturn Uranus. I see the Tower card. I see break down the old, sudden destruction of the old, innovation of the new, get rid of the old and do something progressive. And I just want to introduce the idea, just because pushing in the opposite direction is it's always good with the archetypes to just push gently in the opposite direction and say, well, can we not for a few minutes, taste the defeat of progressivism, just like sometimes that fails us. And sometimes we find the new by sitting with what's limiting or confining. Sometimes the limitation is our freedom. So at any rate, that's what I have for you guys today. Just for your consideration, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat box. I know a lot of you have been sharing beautiful thoughts and reflections as I've been going here. And I'd love to hear more of you in the chat box who are watching this after the live stream is done. I know some of you will be catching it later. So yeah, what are your thoughts? How have you worked that Saturn Uranus tension in your life? Do you have Saturn and Uranus in your birth chart? I'd love to hear from you guys. Okay, have a great rest of your week. Probably be back again tomorrow or Friday. I'm almost done with all my Kickstarter work, so just about ready to get back to 5 days a week.